Christmas time in Southern Hemisphere New Zealand has wound down, which means frazzled and disgruntled mothers up and down the country have wrapped up another Christmas day of slaving over a hot stove preparing a traditional midwinter roast while scorching 100-degree heat blazes through the windows. While I was sitting in shorts with a cold drink to watch Love Actually unfold in a setting of piled snow and reddened noses, scarves and mittens, I got to thinking about The Witcher: Blood Origin. Now, I was never particularly a fan of The Witcher. It seemed to me an average, generic fantasy show that landed at a time when I had soured on the genre. But at least the show was adhering to its source material, contours strong enough to keep modern screenwriting indulgences and impulses in relative check. But then, something dreadful, an ever more recurrent thing happened. A prequel show, The Witcher: Blood Origin, was set into development. In other words, a bunch of screenwriters who had nothing to do with the writing of the material, development of the lore, and fan appreciation for the world would now have their own intellectual property bouncy castle to frolic about in. A chugging locomotive of a franchise that they could shovel great heaps of their own ideological beliefs, cultural inclinations, and personal fantasies into, sending great black plumes of smoky sanctimony trailing away in the air, a situation that, in no particular order, spins my melon, gets my goat, boils my piss, raises my hackles, grinds my gears. On the face of it, there might not seem all that much reason to care. After all, the show has earned some of the worst ratings on Rotten Tomatoes in the aggregator's history. But there is one particular aspect worth mentioning. Diversity and representation on screen is great, and America has diversified to the extent that it is only natural and inevitable that characterization in cinema and streaming be broadly in line with those demographic shifts. That said, there remains a significant divergence between urban and rural, where sparser regions outside of cities remain largely ethnically homogeneous, whilst metropolitan urban centers remain proportionately more diversified. This means, of course, that walking throughout LA, for instance, there will be a mix of Caucasian, African American, Asian, and Latino people passing by. It also means that if you live in such an urban center, if you are, for instance, a screenwriter who has gravitated to such a social milieu, driven by the proximity to the studio system and writing rooms and networks of contacts, it will become conventional to apprehend society through a lens of such multiculturalism. Consider the extent to which diversity in the writer's room has changed in just 10 years, with this composite image of the main writers from fantasy drama Game of Thrones. Now consider this image I found of all the writers of The Witcher: Blood Origin getting together for a chat via Zoom. A vast majority of women, and only a single instance of what Brie Larson would, with whinging disparagement, describe as some 40-year-old white dude. Bear with me here, hold my hand tightly because we're going to go together down a rabbit hole of cause and effect, and we're going to pass through a wardrobe into a snowy landscape of supposition. Diversity and representation on screen is great. It is also feasible you could perhaps go a tiny touch overboard the other way. Let me explain. I believe you can make a reasonable inference between the collection of writers in this writing room and a disproportionate foregrounding of diversity, disproportionate elevation of female characters to levels of power, dignity, style, agency, and physical ability, the downplaying of a white male character to a passive, dim, and reactive dopiness, and an overall palpable feel of wish fulfillment, self-inserts, and utilization of someone else's work as a means to advance empowerment and representation in feebly indulgent ways. In Game of Thrones, you had impressive ethnic diversity on screen. The thing is, it was contextual, so that Winterfell, for example, being a northern sunless climate broadly analogous to Britain or Scandinavia, was largely peopled by Caucasian actors, whereas Dorne, a temperate southern climate broadly analogous to the Mediterranean, was largely peopled by actors from that region. The effect was to provide representation and diversity in a way that maintained exotic and coherent differences between settings. The issue I'm getting at here is that these days, especially in fantasy drama, almost every region and location has become a stand-in for diversely metropolitan Los Angeles. Everywhere you go looks like a slight variation of the same place. The world of The Witcher: Blood Origin is a medieval realm divided into 3 kingdoms that have been at war for 1,000 years. Want to explore the exotic serpent clan who serve the southern kingdom of Darwin? Well, be introduced to a mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino people you would find in relative proportion in metropolitan Los Angeles. What about the Raven clan that defends the northern kingdom of Prussia, a place where the inhabitants are the same mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino in relative proportion to metropolitan Los Angeles? Finally, take a journey to the mysterious far-off kingdom of Zintrea, where the folk are the same mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino in relative proportion to metropolitan Los Angeles. But don't fear, if you still have a yearning for exotic medieval fantasy, then embark on a journey of escapist epic adventure in Willow, set in the ancient kingdom of Ter Asleen, where the folk are the same mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino in relative proportion to metropolitan Los Angeles. And from there, be swept away in the grand fantasy spectacle of The Lord of the Rings of Power, where the insular island society of Numenor is made up of a mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino people in relative proportion to metropolitan Los Angeles. Then be swept forth to the distant and utterly different geography and climate of the Southlands, a pastoral folk made up of exactly the same mix of Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Latino people in relative proportion to metropolitan Los Angeles. When you have the same diverse cultural mix everywhere, it makes it harder to comprehend or become invested as a viewer, to feel the impetus behind ancient rivalries and vendettas between clans, massive historical and cultural differences in tradition. Why one people, who are composed of exactly the same mix of people as another, would have massive variances in class structures. Why one would be peasants and another have castles, or why one would be good and another evil. Ease back in your chair, dear listener, and a tale I shall unfold, whose lightest word will harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thine hair stand on end, and generally make you go all of a dither. In America, what is known as a school prom is referred to most everywhere else in the Western world as a school ball. The worst thing that can happen, as did several times at my old school, was for the organizing committee tasked with deciding the theme for the ball to be made up entirely of girls. Able to indulge every lame flight of fancy without any dissenting voices, they would toss out cringeworthy ideas like an underwater mermaid theme or a jungle exotica theme. What was needed, of course, was for there to be a couple of sensible guys with veto power who could hear such suggestions and go, "No, that sounds like a load of bollocks, we're not doing that." Instead, dear listener, without such checks and balances, we guys all ended up having to pose for photographs on an outrageously tacky set of plastic African spears and masks and strung up nylon leopard print rugs. The Witcher, Blood Origin, is the Hollywood equivalent of that ball organizing committee, and likely to leave as many scarring memories.